Alrighty, good to go. All right. So, talking hip mobility today. So the two concepts at least that you need to be mastering to get your hip mobility on. So at the end of this training, you should have a good idea on some exercises you should be doing to improve your mobility for things like squats and deadlifts, as well as how to kind of better identify the ranges of motion that are giving you issues in the squat. Because quite often people will generally kind of prescribe blanket statements and say, well, okay, you should just, stretch your glutes out or work external rotation or work internal rotation or whatever, without really understanding why we would want either and kind of where either of those come from. So with that said, let's jump in here. So we're going to go share screen and share. Let's do it. Okay, cool. So two things that we need to be going through for hip mobility. So before we jump in, a quick note that I'm going to add here is if you want a free copy or get access to my butt wink training on how to fix butt wink in your squat, just comment depth in the chat or in the comments below if you're watching this on the replay, and I'll get it sent over your way. Cool. So with that said, the two concepts that we need to be talking about today are, first of all, closed chain movement. We'll get into detail on what this is and how it applies to your squat and deadlift. And then the other question is how, right? And we'll elaborate on both of these as we go. So with that said, we need to talk about how the pelvis works. We're not going to get super physio nerdy today, but there are some basic concepts we need to look at here. So your pelvis is composed of basically your hip bones, your left and your right side, and then your sacrum runs right down the middle, right? Now, there's a little bit of movement that you can get within these bones where your sacrum can actually rotate forward on the hip bones or backwards on the hip bones, and vice versa, where the hip bones can kind of rotate backwards or forwards. Now, when this is different from something like an anterior pelvic tilt or a posterior pelvic tilt, it's a pretty common term that gets thrown around. These are relative movements that happen within the pelvis. So the reason that these are important is they can bias internal or external rotation or a hip shift or how you move through certain ranges of motion in a squat or deadlift, kind of any closed chain lower body movement. So generally speaking, this counter nutation, this one right here, where your sacrum is rolled back and your hips are rolled forward relative to the sacrum, is associated with more hip external rotation. So the hips are more open. Now this can happen on one or both sides, depending on how we're moving here, right? On the other hand, if we're looking at nutation, this one here, again, don't worry too much about these words right now, is the hips rolling back on the sacrum. Now this tends to close the hips off and will generally be associated with more internal rotation, right? How this is illustrated makes it look like your sacrum moves like 30 degrees on your hips. We're talking a couple degrees. It's kind of illustrated this way just to make it easier to see. Okay. So with that said, we're going to talk about hip flexion. So when you squat, when you deadlift, the thing that everybody needs is to be able to bend their hips, to flex their hips. That's literally the joint bending, right? So if we think of 0 degrees as you standing completely straight with your leg in line with your hip and your spine, 0 degrees of flexion. As we start to go through the first 60 degrees or so from here to about there, right? This is typically in a squat, you're going to see people kind of bend forward like that, right? But those first 60 degrees are more correlated with external rotation. This next chunk, about 60 to 100 degrees of hip flexion or so. So if you're going down, so from here to there, right? This is kind of where most people start to approach parallel, is associated with more hip internal rotation, right? And then from there, 100 degrees and more, we're looking at more hip external rotation bias again because of how the sacrum has to move. This will make a little bit more sense as we go through the training. But I want to lay this groundwork so that we can talk about it. If you want to read more about it, you can always go to Zach Couples' website. He's got some really good content on this stuff. With that said, lower body movements. So a lot of people will take a look at, their hip flexion and kind of pull their knee to their chest. or they'll test their hamstrings, or they'll do like a figure 4 stretch and cross one ankle over the opposite knee and look at their hip external rotation, that kind of stuff. And these are what we call open chain movements, right? So your feet aren't attached to anything. You're kind of just flailing your legs around in space. In an upper body example, an open chain movement would be something like a bench press where the load is moving, but you aren't. And then a push-up would be a closed chain. For lower body, we'd be looking at something like a squat being closed chain and a leg press being open chain, right? The reason this matters is we need to look at hip flexion not from just flinging our legs up, or external rotation not from just, twisting our leg open, but looking at how the pelvis moves on legs that are fixed to the ground. This is why we talked about this nutation, counter nutation earlier, okay? This tends to be the hardest slide for most people to wrap their heads around because everyone wants to look at hip external rotation by just twisting their femurs around, right? So with all that said, what we want to be looking at here when we're looking at these ranges of motion in closed chain, the cool thing about being in closed chain is we can drive more internal and external rotation on sides. So if I'm static, right, and I have my feet stuck on the ground and my hips turn to the right, I'm going to internally rotate or move into or close off my right side. And I'm going to externally rotate or move off of or move away from or open up my left side. So if I have a sticky hip, for example, where it feels like I can never quite get in there and it's always really pinchy, I might want to work on getting some internal rotation focused movements, which we'll talk about in a second, in order to get into that hip and actually build mobility in a closed chain environment instead of just arbitrarily stretching myself out. The cool thing with this is because it's more closed chain, like the movements we're trying to improve, your squat and your deadlift, it's really beneficial because we've got one less degree of variation from what we're trying to improve on, right? So that relative movement where if we're kind of closing one side and internally rotating, we're opening the other is really, really beneficial at promoting looseness and especially at building internal rotation in the hips, which is where most lifters tend to struggle. Powerlifting tends to be a very extension dominant, very externally rotated and open sport. And where most lifters tend to lose mobility is that ability to internally rotate. So let's talk about how we can get there. So in building single leg movements, you get the ability to have one leg on the ground in one position, and then the other is on the ground as well to drive that relative position. So for example, if we had a lifter who consistently around halfway down always seemed like they just lose tension, or their knee would fall in halfway down or something like that, where they're kind of in that 60 to 100 degrees of hip flexion, we'd say, hey, you know what, this error seems to be happening every time this lifter is needing to access internal rotation. There's probably something missing there. So we'd probably want to look at more internal rotation movements like this. So this staggered deadlift, I like more for building internal rotation than something like a single leg deadlift, because we're actually able to, instead of just sort of tilting the hips over on one leg, we're really using both sides to put ourselves on that side. So the left leg being back, the toe being elevated, all that's going to help push us further into this left hip in this case. And then the right foot being forward is going to further push us into the left hip by way of kind of being off of that right side. If we switch the feet up, we could do it the other way, depending on which hip is more limited, right? On the other hand, if we had a lifter who's really, really limited in hip external rotation, right? So they're constantly super, super tight glutes. They can get halfway down in a squat, but then they've got a ton of butt wink and they can never seem to really get, to full depth without moving their spine. Or maybe in a sumo deadlift, they don't have that hip abduction to open their hips up enough, things like that. But really looking at that really deep hip flexion, think anything where there's like a big, big mobility demand on the hips. This more external rotation bias movement might be a better solution for a squat for you as a movement prep drill, for example. So just as a warm up in a way to kind of get things aligned, get loose instead of just doing a bunch of stretching, right? So here, instead of elevating the toe to kind of push us into the hip, we've elevated the heel and we're loading up the lead leg to kind of load that more external rotation biased leg, that front leg we're going to push off of, right? So some food for thought. These are, far from a comprehensive prescription, but within the scope of what we're talking about today, we've got a good idea on where to start for some lower body movement prep for internal rotation and where to go for external rotation. Okay. So that's part one, right? The second part that we need to ask, and this is typically it's a good follow-up to what we've just talked about, as well as a good standalone piece for understanding mobility as a whole, not just hip mobility, but we have to ask, how am I driving rotation? So we'll go back to that squat example, because just mapping out hip flexion on a squat tends to be a little bit easier. But if we're looking at, the knees falling in on a squat, it generally doesn't mean you need to stretch your butt out, right? Your glutes are probably not that tight. If they are tight, they're probably tight for a reason, but your glutes being tight is not the reason for your glutes being tight. So typically speaking, a lot of the lifters that I'll see where their knees fall in, especially lifters where their knees fall in on the way up in the squat or on the concentric portion of the deadlift, is because they have a lack of internal rotation on one or both hips. So the way that personally I differentiate this is if I saw a lifter going down and on the way down, they like shifted over to a side really aggressively, I would say they probably can't move into the hip that they're shifting away from. So we'd probably want to work on building more internal rotation on that side. On the other hand, if we saw a lifter where they go down reasonably symmetrically, but then they can't come up without having a knee drop in or having both knees drop in, I'd say the side where the knee is falling in is going to be the one where they're missing internal rotation because they can't keep internal rotation. And so how they're driving internal rotation at the hip is by pushing the knee in to leverage that hip into internal rotation. This can get a little bit muddy, but hopefully that framework of, if you're making the error going down, go look at the side that you're moving away from. And then if you're lacking internal rotation on the way up, take a look at the side that you're losing position with. And if you're losing position on both sides, there's nothing wrong with, training both sides with an internal rotation focus, for example, right? On the other hand, right, if we look at that squat or the bottom position of a deadlift, this is one where, again, we need to really bend those hips well past 100 degrees, right? Especially in a conventional deadlift. A lot of people will say, oh, your hamstrings are tight or your hip flexors are tight. You should be working on that and stretching those out. Yes, stretching those out will let you twist your leg more and kind of artificially create more external rotation, but it won't change your pelvis, right? We're not changing that relationship between the hip bones and the sacrum. So that's where we need to look at something like this, for example. And you can scale this, right? You can make this front foot go actually quite high, or you could elevate both feet to really get into some very deep ranges of motion. But you're lacking that hip external rotation where the hips can kind of open up and the sacrum can counternutate and roll backwards in that deep squat. And so what'll happen is your body says, no problem, I'm going to roll the hips back to basically make it so that I don't have to go into as much hip flexion. And I can create some of that movement by just tilting and orienting the pelvis backwards. So I realize some of this goes against some conventional wisdom for stretching and stuff like that, but try it out for yourself. You'll see it works. I've had a lot of success with it with my athletes. Yeah, like we have to look at the biomechanics instead of always chasing symptoms. Otherwise, you're always just going to feel stiff. You're never really going to change how you move per se. It's just one of those ones of try these out. Next time you warm up for a squat or deadlift workout, give these a shot. And I'd venture to say you'll probably feel a difference in the quality of your movement, and it'll be reflexive. It'll feel like, hey, I feel a lot looser. I feel like I'm moving a lot better. I can load my feet better today. My brace feels really strong. And it's just a win overall. You're not having to stretch and then learn 15 different cues and do all these other things to a roundabout way to kind of get better. So I'll circle back on this. We'll talk about questions, but again, just a reminder, if you want access to my free training on how to fix butt link in your squat, we've got a whole video training on that. It's not a slideshow. It's actually an in-gym demonstration. Comment depth in the comments or in the chat, and I'll get you access to that free video training. Other than that, if anybody's got any questions, drop them in the chat right now or in the comments on the replay, and I'll help get them answered for you. All right, perfect. So looks like we're all good. We'll wrap up for today then. Thank you very much, guys, and we'll chat soon. Catch you on the next one.